Sometimes loneliness is so heavy that a man does things he would never imagine doing. Thomas Walker had spent the last 10 years working on his small ranch on the outskirts of Cedar Valley, a town that barely deserved the name. 3 dirt streets, a church of peeled wood, a warehouse that sold a little bit of everything, and a hall where men drank to forget the relentless heat of the desert. Life there was simple, predictable, and terribly lonely. The wind blew steadily across the arid plains, carrying with it the smell of sage and parched earth. Thomas watched the horizon every morning as he milked his 3 cows, waiting for something he couldn't even define. Hope, perhaps. A change. Anything that would break the monotony of the days that repeated themselves like the footprints of his horse on the same trail. It was on a particularly hot September afternoon that Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. Sitting at the rugged wooden table in his small kitchen, a quivering pen in his labor-calloused hand, he wrote his first letter to a mail-order marriage agency in San Francisco. The words came out hesitantly at first, then flowed like dammed water that finally finds a crack in the rock. "I am an honest, hard-working man, a landowner," he wrote. "I'm looking for a partner to share this life in the countryside. I'm not rich, but I can provide what is necessary for a family. I'm 35 years old, and I've never married." He didn't mention the nights when he talked to his animals just to hear a voice. He didn't talk about how he would sometimes stand on the porch for hours, stargazing and imagining what it would be like to have someone by his side. He didn't say that there were days when the silence in the house was so deep that it hurt his ears. 3 weeks later, the response arrived along with the weekly mail. Thomas's heart pounded when he recognized the elegant envelope with his careful handwriting in the address. Margaret Sullivan presented herself as a 28-year-old orphan woman who had recently lost her job at a textile factory. She wrote in beautiful handwriting about her willingness to start a new life, away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. "I am not a classic beauty," the letter said, "but I am a woman of good heart and hard-working hands. I know how to cook, sew, and take care of a house. I believe that true love grows through mutual respect and honest company." Thomas read and reread those words until he memorized them. For the first time in years, he found himself whistling while working. He began to tidy up the house more carefully, repaired the fence he had left for later, and even planted some wildflowers near the entrance. Hope had found a place to nestle in his chest. The letters followed one another over the following months. Margaret told about her life in San Francisco, about the constant noise of the streets, and how she dreamed of a place where she could see the stars without the interference of the city lights. Thomas described the clear desert mornings, the sunrise that painted the distant mountains pink and gold, the peace he found in the simple toil of the land. They exchanged photographs. Margaret's showed a woman with an ordinary but pleasant face, brown hair combed simply, eyes that looked gentle even in the faded image. Thomas sent his only decent photograph, taken by the traveling photographer who had passed through the city the previous year. It was in December that Margaret wrote, accepting his marriage proposal. "I will arrive in the mail wagon on the 15th of January, he said. "I hope we can build together a life of simple and true happiness." Thomas spent the next few weeks in a frenzy he couldn't control. She renovated the entire house, bought new furniture from the city warehouse, ordered a wedding dress from the fabric store. Reverend Patterson agreed to officiate the ceremony as soon as Margaret arrived and settled in. The morning of January 15 dawned clear and cold. Thomas took a long shower, put on his best clothes, and combed his hair with brilliance. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie to the stained mirror in his room. Today, his bachelor life would come to an end. He arrived at the wagon station 2 hours before the scheduled time. Other residents of the city were also there, curious to meet the mail-order bride who had caused so much uproar. Thomas tried to appear calm, but his heart pounded in his chest like the hooves of a racing horse. When the cloud of dust finally appeared on the horizon, Thomas felt his mouth dry up. The mail cart approached slowly, swaying on the stones of the path. He adjusted his hat and took a deep breath, preparing himself for the moment he had imagined hundreds of times. The wagon stopped with a creak of brakes and wood. The coachman got off and began to unload the parcels and mail. Thomas waited, his heart beating so hard that he was sure everyone around could hear him. Then the wagon door opened. The first thing Thomas saw was a boot. A women's boot, but bigger than any women's boots he had ever seen in his life. Then a navy blue skirt appeared in the opening of the wagon, followed by another boot that touched the ground with a dull sound on the beaten earth. Margaret Sullivan got off the wagon like a mountain that decides to walk. She was at least 6 feet tall, perhaps more, with shoulders as broad as a woodcutter's, and hands that seemed capable of taming an angry bull. His presence filled the space around the wagon as a storm fills the sky. Thomas felt his legs wobbly. The murmurs of the small crowd that had gathered to witness the arrival of the bride abruptly ceased. A heavy silence fell over everyone like a wet blanket. Even the children stopped playing and stared open-mouthed. Margaret looked around with light blue eyes that seemed used to dealing with surprise and discomfort from others. She carried a small suitcase of worn-out leather in one hand and a ridiculously small parasol, for her size, in the other. His face had the features Thomas recognized from the photograph, but the image had not captured the true dimension of his physical presence. She walked toward Thomas with firm steps that made the earth shake slightly beneath her feet. The other men instinctively moved away like wild animals that recognize a larger predator. Thomas remained still, caught between shock and a strange fascination. "You must be Thomas Walker," she said, and her voice was surprisingly soft for someone of her size. There was a polite accent there, traces of a refined upbringing that contrasted with his imposing appearance. Thomas could only nod his head. His tongue seemed to have forgotten how to form words. Margaret stretched out a gloved hand, and when he squeezed it, he felt solid bones like oak wood under the soft skin. "I imagine I'm not exactly what you expected," she continued, with a smile that mixed kindness and resignation. "Photographs sometimes lie by omission." The crowd began to slowly disperse, whispering to each other like wind through the dry leaves. Thomas could feel the curious looks and muffled comments that would follow him for the next few months. Cedar Valley was too small to keep secrets, and too big to let new things go unnoticed. "Welcome," Thomas finally managed to say, finding his voice buried under layers of surprise. "The house is 3 kilometers from here. I brought my horse and buggy." Margaret looked at the little buggy as an adult would look at a child's toy. "I'm afraid your buggy may not support my weight," she said in the same practical tone with which time is discussed. "I walked longer distances." They walked side by side down the main street, Margaret carrying her luggage as if it were made of feathers. Thomas pulled the empty buggy, feeling smaller with each step. The windows of the houses were filled with curious faces, curtains moved discreetly, and he could practically hear the conversations that would begin as soon as they passed. The silence between them stretched like the dirt road that led to the ranch. Thomas struggled to find something to say, anything that could break the awkward tension that had settled between them. Margaret walked with the tranquility of someone who had learned to deal with uncomfortable situations. "Your letters mentioned that you raised cattle," she said finally, breaking the silence as if breaking a dry branch. "A few heads," Thomas replied, grateful to have a safe topic. "It's not a big herd, but you can live. What about you?" His letters talked about working in a factory. Margaret nodded, adjusting her parasol to protect herself from the midday sun. "Textile factory. He sewed men's clothes, delicate work for big hands," he said, looking at his own hands as if they were strange tools he had found. They passed by the church where Reverend Patterson was waiting for them at the door, obviously curious about the new arrival. The short, thin man had to tilt his head back in an almost comical way to look into Margaret's face. She greeted him politely, but Thomas noticed how she bowed slightly, an automatic gesture of someone who had spent her life trying to make herself smaller. The walk to the ranch took 45 minutes. Margaret showed no sign of fatigue, but Thomas was sweating under the bright sun and the weight of the situation. His modest house, which had seemed fitting when he had imagined it housing an ordinary wife, now looked like a doll's house in the face of the reality that walked beside him. When they arrived at the property, Margaret stopped at the entrance and looked at the wooden building with a tin roof, the small vegetable garden, the corral with the 3 cows, and the barn that Thomas had painted especially for his arrival. "It's a beautiful place," she said, and there was genuine sincerity in her voice. Calm. "It must be pleasant to wake up here every morning." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. For the first time since she had stepped out of the wagon, he heard something but polite resignation in her voice. There was a desire there, a thirst for peace that he recognized because he felt the same way. But when Margaret made her way to the front door, Thomas realized that she would have to bend down considerably to get in. The reality of his new situation hit him like a punch in the stomach. Nothing in her life had been planned for someone like Margaret Sullivan. And for the first time since he had decided to seek a mail-order wife, Thomas Walker began to wonder if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The first few days were a strange dance between 2 strangers, trying to find their rhythm in a melody that neither of them knew. Thomas had prepared the back room for Margaret, but when she first entered, her head almost touched the low ceiling. She watched the space in silence, mentally gauging whether she could move comfortably, then simply nodded and placed her small suitcase on the bed Thomas had bought especially for her. The bed looked like a piece of children's furniture under his presence. Margaret adapted to the house like water that finds its way between the stones. She moved with calculated care, always bending over passages, always testing her weight before she sat down in a chair. Thomas watched her discreetly as she explored her new home, noticing how she automatically ducked even when she wasn't needed, as if she had learned to take up less space than she really needed. In the kitchen, she had to kneel down to use the low stove. His huge hands handled the small utensils with surprising delicacy, as if they were made of glass. When he prepared his first dinner, the aroma that filled the house brought a sense of home that Thomas hadn't felt in years. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had cooked in his kitchen but himself. The meal was consumed in awkward silence. Thomas, sitting in his usual chair, Margaret hunched over the table in a position that seemed uncomfortable but necessary. The plates looked like cups of tea in his hands, the forks like toothpicks. She ate with measured movements, clearly aware of how her presence dominated the small space. The next morning, Thomas woke up to a strange sound coming from the corral. He dressed quickly and went out to investigate, finding Margaret talking softly to Betsy, his most temperamental cow. The animal, which used to be aggressive with strangers, was calm as Thomas had never seen. Margaret milked her with steady, efficient movements, her large hands completely covering the cow's teats. When she got up carrying the bucket full of milk, Thomas realized that she had done in 15 minutes a job that used to take her half an hour. His other 2 cows waited patiently in line, like disciplined soldiers awaiting orders. Margaret carried 3 buckets full of milk at once, walking toward the house with firm steps that left deep footprints in the damp earth of morning dew. Thomas followed her in silence, admiring against her will the natural efficiency of her movements. During the next week, a strange routine settled between them. Margaret was waking up before dawn and had already finished milking by the time Thomas got out of bed. She prepared breakfast while he tended the horses, and they ate together at the small table that now seemed even smaller. Then Thomas would go out to work in the pasture, and Margaret would take over the household chores. But they were not ordinary household chores. Thomas would come home from work to find the fence that needed repair already tidy, the posts that were wobbly firmly planted in the earth. She had carried logs on her own that he would need help moving. The barn that needed a new roof was being repaired by her, who climbed onto the roof with impressive agility for her stature. One afternoon, Thomas came home early to find Margaret in the backyard, holding a sick calf in her lap as if it were a lamb. The animal, which weighed at least 80 pounds, was nestled against her chest as she gave him medicine with infinite patience. His huge hands caressed the calf's head with a tenderness that made something tighten in Thomas's chest. It was at that moment that he realized that Margaret Sullivan wasn't just a big woman. She was a person who had learned to turn her difference into strength, her strangeness into usefulness. Her every move demonstrated years of experience dealing with a world that hadn't been made for someone like her. But there was also something more. In the moments when she thought he wasn't looking, Thomas saw a deep sadness in his blue eyes. It was the same sadness he recognized in his own reflection in the mirror, the mark of someone who had spent too much time alone, too much time being different, too much time carrying a silent burden. In the evening, after dinner, they would sit on the small porch, Margaret in a chair which Thomas had reinforced especially for her, he in his usual place. They watched the sunset paint the sky in orange and pink tones, listened to the wind whisper through the undergrowth of the desert. Neither of them talked much, but the silent company had an uncanny comfort. Thomas began to notice small details about Margaret. How she always expected him to pass through the doors first, how she lowered her head instinctively even in the open air, how her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was paying attention. It was as if she was constantly apologizing for existing. One night, while she was washing the dishes for dinner, Thomas saw her look out the kitchen window at the starry sky with an expression of longing that he knew well. It was the same expression he himself had carried for years before deciding to seek a mate, the expression of someone who dreamed of connection, of belonging, of a place in the world where he could simply be accepted. That night, Thomas Walker began to understand that perhaps he and Margaret Sullivan had more in common than their physical differences suggested. Both were people who didn't fit easily into the world. Both had spent years adapting to spaces that weren't made for them. Both carried the silent mark of loneliness. But understanding that and knowing what to do with that understanding were two completely different things. The moment of truth came one afternoon in March, when the first wildflowers were beginning to paint the desert with patches of color. Thomas had gone out to check the north fence when he heard screams coming from the direction of the town. He rode quickly to investigate and found an agitated crowd forming near the warehouse. Jimmy Peterson, a 12-year-old boy known for his dangerous curiosity, had fallen into the abandoned well behind the blacksmith shop. The pit was more than 50 feet deep, and the men of the city were leaning over the opening with inadequate ropes and desperate plans. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, walking briskly with earth-shaking footsteps. She assessed the situation with calm, practical eyes, while the men discussed options that everyone knew were insufficient. The pit was too narrow for any of the adult males to descend, and too deep for the available ropes to be useful. Without a word, Margaret knelt at the edge of the well. His huge hands tested the strength of the ancient stones that formed the wall. Then, with calculated movements, she began to descend. Her long arms and impressive strength allowed her to move along the walls of the pit like a natural ladder, her feet finding support where others would see only smooth stone. The crowd was absolutely silent. Thomas felt his heart race as he watched Margaret disappear into the darkness of the well. He could hear her soft voice echoing from the depths, reassuring words addressed to the frightened boy. 15 minutes? That seemed like hours passed before Margaret reappeared, slowly climbing up with Jimmy Peterson, clinging to her back like a frightened puppy. She emerged from the well like an apparition, her clothes soiled with dirt and slime, but her eyes shining with a fierce determination that Thomas had never seen before. When she finally got the boy safely to the ground, the crowd erupted in applause and shouts of gratitude. Jimmy's mother wept as she embraced her son, and the boy himself looked at Margaret with an admiration bordering on adoration. For the first time since her arrival in Cedar Valley, Margaret Sullivan was surrounded by smiling faces instead of curious or uncomfortable looks. At that moment, Thomas saw something turn into Margaret's face, The constant tension she carried on her shoulders eased, the automatic curvature of her posture straightened. She was being seen not as an outsider, but as a hero. Not as someone too big for the world, but as someone exactly the right size to save a life. In the weeks that followed, the town's attitude toward Margaret changed completely. The merchants greeted her warmly when she went shopping. Children would run up to her on the street, not to stare open-mouthed, but to hear stories about St. Francis or ask for advice on how to build things. Farmers began to seek it out when they needed help with heavy work that required exceptional strength. Thomas watched these changes with a mixture of pride and something he took a long time to recognize as true love. Not the romantic love she had imagined when she wrote her first letter to the marriage agency, but something deeper and more real. It was the love that is born of respect, admiration, recognition of genuine value in a person. One evening, as they dined together at the table that now seemed no longer too small, but just the right size for two people who had learned to share space, Thomas made a decision. He had spent weeks trying to find the right words and finally realized that the simplest words were the best. Margaret was serving apple pie made with dried fruit that she had bought at the store. His large hands held the small knife with his usual delicacy. Thomas watched her for a moment, admiring the gentle concentration on her face before speaking. He said that he had thought long and hard about the wedding they had planned, about how the circumstances were different from what they had both imagined. He said he didn't want her to feel obligated to fulfill an agreement made through letters with a stranger, that he understood if she wanted to go back to San Francisco or go somewhere else where she could start over. Margaret stopped cutting the pie and looked at him with those light blue eyes that had become familiar and dear. She said she had also thought long and hard about her situation, that he knew she was not the wife he had imagined when he wrote his first letter. But then she talked about the quiet mornings at the ranch, about how satisfying it was to work with her hands and to see the concrete results of her efforts. About how he had slept better in recent weeks than he had slept in years in San Francisco, about how she felt useful, necessary, valued, not in spite of her difference, but because of it. She said that if he was willing to have a partner instead of a traditional wife, someone who could work alongside him and help build something lasting, then she would want to stay. Not out of obligation or lack of options, but because she had found a place where she could truly be herself. Thomas felt something open in his chest, like a flower that finally receives sun. He said that partnership was exactly what he had always wanted, even when he didn't know what to call it. They were married on an April afternoon, in a simple ceremony in the peeled wooden church. Margaret had to bend down to walk past the altar, but when she and Thomas held hands before Reverend Patterson, she stood tall and proud. Their hands fit perfectly, big and small, rough and rough, scarred by honest work. The whole city attended. Jimmy Peterson was in the front row with his family, watching in awe of the woman who had saved his life. Neighboring farmers came to pay their respects to Thomas Walker's new partner, the woman who had proven that size and strength could be just what a community needed. When they left the church as husband and wife, Margaret no longer had to bow down. She walked with her head held high, her steady steps shaking the earth slightly, but now that sound was music to Thomas's ears. It was the sound of someone who had found his place in the world, someone who no longer needed to apologize for existing. Years later, when travelers passed through the Cedar Valley and asked about the unusual couple who owned the most prosperous ranch in the area, locals told the story with pride. They talked about how Margaret Walker could carry a grown bull when needed, how her gardens were the greenest in the desert, how she had saved 3 children from dangerous situations over the years. But mostly they talked about how she and Thomas had built something rare and precious together, a marriage based not on appearance or conventional expectations, but on the mutual recognition of value, on the complementarity of different strengths, on the understanding that sometimes true love arrives in a completely different package than we imagined. Thomas Walker had written his first letter to the marriage agency looking for a companion for his solitary life. What he found was much better, a partner who had turned his quiet existence into a daily adventure, a woman whose striking presence had taught an entire city that greatness was not a matter of physical size, but of heart size. And Margaret Sullivan had left San Francisco looking for a place where she could disappear into the crowd. Instead, he found a place where he could shine exactly as he was, where his difference was not only accepted, but celebrated as a rare gift in a land that needed exceptional people to thrive. Together, they proved that sometimes the best marriages begin not with passion at first sight, but with the courage to see beyond appearances and recognize in the other person a heart that beats in the same rhythm as yours, even when the bodies that house those hearts are as different as day and night. If you were moved by the story of Thomas and Margaret, and would like to discover more touching narratives from the Wild West that explore the strength of the human heart in the face of life's challenges, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Here you will find weekly news stories of cowboys, pioneers, and brave people who built their lives in the Badlands of the American West.